Well, hello. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our International Women's Day LinkedIn Live session titled Embracing Equity, Celebrating Women at Checkout.com. It's super exciting to be here with you all today. My name is Camilla Boyer. I am the Global Head of Communications at Checkout, and I will be moderating our panel today. So before I bring up the rest of our panelists, I just want to say a few words about why we're here today. So at Checkout, we are building a culture where we aim to amplify and strengthen our colleagues' voices and create an inclusive and equitable workplace that celebrates diversity. And that ties really well into this year's International Women's Day theme, which is Embrace Equity. For those of you that don't know, there's quite an important distinction between equity and equality. Equality refers to the equal distribution of resources and opportunities, whereas equity recognizes that oftentimes different people are starting out from different places and that we should allocate resources accordingly. So we believe in a focus on gender equity, and we think that that needs to be a part of the conversation for every community in the world today. And that's really what we're here to talk about. So without further ado, I would like to bring up my esteemed panelists for our conversation. Hello. Okay, so very excitingly, I'm joined by Celine Dufatel, who is Checkout's president and COO. Hi, Celine.
Hi.
I'm joined by Jenny Hadlow, who is our VP of Sales Operations. Hi, Jenny.
Hey, Camilla.
Hello. And last but not least, I'm joined by Laura Morgan Walsh, who is our VP of Client Services.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Great. Well, it's super exciting to be here with you all today. Before I jump into the questions, just going to go through some quick housekeeping points. So this session is going to last about 40 minutes. We will go through some questions that I have for this wonderful group, and then we will have some time for Q&A from the audience at the end as well. So please do drop your comments into the comments section on LinkedIn, and we look forward to seeing those and answering them. So with that, let's get stuck right in. I would love to hear from all of you. What does this year's International Women's Day theme, Embrace Equity, mean to you? Celine, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Super excited to be with all of you and looking forward to this conversation. I think this year's theme is really critical because equity is where it all starts, right? As you were saying, Camilla, on the journey. And for me, I always think about it as a mother as well as an executive, and the opportunity for equity for my children in terms of opportunities and the career and the things that they can have access to, and the opportunities that they can forge is just absolutely critical. So I'm very excited about this year's theme.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, for me, I think it's about driving awareness and education. I think the DEI community has done such a great job in the past decade about driving a dialogue about these differences. But as you mentioned, Camilla, there is a big difference between equality and equity. And I think it's one that continues to be little understood. I mean, even for myself coming into this dialogue, I'm going out and refreshing my learning on it and my reading on it, because it is nuanced differences, but that mean significantly different mindsets that people bring to solving these problems. So I think putting it front and center and driving that education is such an important step one for everyone to then adjust their mindset about what it means as they apply programs to drive diversity and equity and inclusion in their companies.
For sure. That's awesome. Thanks. Laura, anything from you?
Yeah, it really resonated with me this year because I suppose I've spent the last number of years working with teams to build products and processes that meet the customer where they're at so that a customer can then flourish. Why would it be any different in the world as women approach it? Why are we not starting the conversation on equality where the woman says she needs the support, where her starting point is, and then carving a path towards equality? So it really resonated with me this year more than most.
It's awesome. Thank you all for that. So I think we can all agree that one really important part of sort of our movements towards equality and equity is about advocating for change. That's how change happens. So Laura, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about your experiences advocating for change within or outside of our industry?
Sure. I've spent most of my career advocating for change in one way or another, whether it was in sport as a woman or in the workplace. And in my experience, it requires two things. One, calling out the change that you want to see, and it's so uncomfortable. Oftentimes, you're the one that is calling out what you see happening in a meeting, looking to have a conversation afterwards to bring awareness to that, or you're having a conversation with some of your partners, maybe the recruitment team, to say, we are not going any further in this process until I see more female candidates or more diverse candidates on the slate. It's uncomfortable. You nearly hope somebody else is going to see it so that it doesn't have to be you to do it. But you have to do it, and it's your responsibility as a leader to do it. So I think the first thing is calling out the change that you want to see is very important. The second thing for me has been about telling your story, the power of the story that you can tell as a woman. I did a master's a couple of years ago, and in doing that, there was a research paper that I took on empathy and the role that empathy of a leader plays in returning a woman to the workplace, and the challenges, whether it helps, whether it has any impact at all. And what I found was, it being tech, every leader bar one was a man that the women were returning to. And where a man and a male leader had firsthand experience of either his partner or his sister returning to the workplace following a career break, his empathy was really high. And the team that he led, their empathy was really high. And as a result, the return to the workplace, while it's always difficult for the woman, there was a nurturing environment, there was a supportive and inclusive environment that woman returned into. Where that wasn't the case, and the male did not have firsthand experience of someone that he held dear to him having gone through this experience, his empathy was lower. More importantly, the team that he led, their empathy was then lower as well. And while it's always a difficult thing for a woman, the environment that she went into was far more difficult. It was a much harder path. Interestingly, the women themselves supported each other in those cases and made it through anyway, which is what we do really well. But it kind of underpinned for me the influence that we can have in telling our stories, and never to underestimate where you can begin that, either in your home or in your network. You know, grab that man that is in your life, a brother, a son, a partner, a friend, and you tell them your story. Do not underestimate how that will influence them and where they can take that story, whether it's to their team, whether it's in sport, whether it's wherever it is. Do not underestimate. Go tell your story.
I think there's so many interesting points in there, and I love those anecdotes. I think it speaks super powerfully to why representation is so important, right? And why diversity is so important in all the different spaces we create. Just before we move on, one quick anecdote from me, which is I was explaining to a male friend of mine the other day why I can't walk through the park at night if I want to. Like, I have to take the long way around. And like, I had shown up late for something, and that's why I was telling the story, and it just like blew his mind. And to your point, it's about telling our story, right? Because it's not easy to put yourself in somebody else's shoes all of the time. So it's super interesting.
That's right.
Celine, I want to ask you a little bit about the DEIB executive sponsor role that you recently took on at Checkout, which is obviously a huge deal given that you are our president and COO. I'm hoping you can share a little bit more about your involvement in being an advocate and promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at Checkout, and maybe even some of the initiatives that you're working on with the team behind the scenes.
Sure. And I love what Laura said about advocating for change. And I would say that, you know, as a DEIB sponsor, it starts with a lot of the similar things that Laura was talking about, right? It starts with tone at the top. So how am I calling out bias, you know, if I see it? How am I influencing our other male leaders and leadership team members to set the right tone, to set the right culture, right? I view that as a critical part of my role. And one of the places, you know, I've started is, you know, myself building a very diverse team, right? So I'm very proud of the team that I've built. and the fact that it is, a high representation of women, also high representation of people of diverse ethnic backgrounds. So to me, that's a place where you start, because those leaders will then carry a similar message forward in terms of culture and representation, and making sure that we call out bias anytime we see it. So that to me is a critical part of the change. The second part is also our communities, right? So it's making sure that we foster strong communities where people, to Laura's points, can come and tell their stories, also hear the stories of others, find some element of comfort, of empathy, of engagement. And I think that that's really important. So one of the things we'll do this year is really make sure all of our communities are vibrant and have access to the right resources to kind of promote the kind of content and community and engagement that they want to have.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. There's definitely a lot of important work to do, and that's being done. So that's great. Before we move on to the next section, I'm actually just going to ask a question that's come in from LinkedIn, which I think is really relevant to the topic that we're on right now. So one user asked, what do you recommend in terms of gaining confidence to challenge the status quo regarding equity in the workplace, especially if you're not an executive? And I'll just throw that out to the group. So anyone chime in if you have a thought there.
Well, I don't think anyone lands at being an executive. You work your way up to that. And I think it's important to find your comfort area, but it's also, it does boil down to courage. There's no dressing this up. It takes courage to be the one that will advocate for change. But equally, I think finding allies and finding people in leadership that you can talk to about that. You can go and consult with somebody before you stick your hand up, or ask for that meeting to give that feedback, to say, here's how I felt in that meeting. Here's what I saw. How should I address this? Is this the right way? How do you think this would land? I think that has served me well in finding my feet and gaining that courage and confidence to advocate for change. Jenny, you were going to come in there, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, I come from the sales side of the house, and there's so much to how you ask questions and how you deliver feedback. And so I would also say, companies have built very open dialogue, and Checkout is one of those companies as well, where there's always the opportunity, whether it's at an AEM or with a manager or with an exec at lunch, to ask open questions. But how you ask them is such an important piece of it. And it's not just about this topic, it's about everything, which is why I say I come from the sales world, where how you ask questions is something we train on. But I say it to say, asking open-ended questions, not bringing a negative emotion or a combative nature to it, drives a dialogue instead of a conflict. And that's what we're trying to get out of this, right? Like, we're all trying to get a dialogue. And so I would say, being super, it is about courage. Lord's absolutely right. It's about courage to open your mouth and speak at a company meeting, or ask the question of a more senior person. But when you do open your mouth, it's really important that you're opening a profile of question that can be answered and that can be engaged with. And so I'd also encourage people to be really mindful about that, because that will drive the best outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a super great point. It's all about sort of inquiring about other people's perspectives rather than leading with your own, right? And trying to sort of gain allies that way. Celine, I don't know if you had anything to add on that, or I'm happy to go on to the next question.
No, I mean, the only thing I'd say is your voice matters so much. Those you calling out that one situation, and it could be, talking to a female colleague after a meeting and say, I noticed that you sat in the back and you didn't participate. Were you not feeling comfortable? How could I help you be comfortable next time? Or it could be going to perhaps, a male colleague who didn't listen to one of the voices in the room, and to say, I noticed that in that interaction, you weren't really hearing this person. Help me understand what was going on. All those little gestures have an incredible impact on the culture of your organization and in driving change. And so, to Laura's point, it takes courage, but that's how we're all going to drive change together.
Yeah, 100%. I think what you said is a perfect example, right? Help me understand what's going on rather than coming straight in with advice or something like that. So I think that's great. Amazing. So the next thing that we have to contend with is overcoming biases. This is obviously also something that we've all sort of come across in our different journeys, I think. Jenny, I'd love to start with you and just hear how you encourage and support your team members to identify and challenge their own biases with the goal of creating a more inclusive work environment.
Yeah, I think what Laura mentioned about sharing your own story is so important here to challenging bias. And I'll start with a personal example, which is the first time I took on a truly global role, so a team based in every time zone across the world. I was pregnant with my first child, and the question was asked of me as a part of the conversation of like, is this a fit? And the answer for me was, if anything, and the answer I live by, because I still have a team that's in every time zone around the world, is it's a great fit for me, for my way of working. Being able to do a call at 5 a.m. and at 10 o'clock at night actually sometimes works great. and it means that I can do work at a time when my 2 young children are asleep. And so, it is challenging the norms at every at every point. And that's not the case for everyone, for every woman, that's a schedule that they want to keep. But for some women, actually, an unusual schedule helps you accomplish everything that you need to. And so I would say, being vocal about what works for you and challenging some of the assumptions. Assumptions are so dangerous. Is really important. The other thing, this is such a boring answer, but it's so important, is training on this. Like, this is like unconscious bias is a very real thing. And it's something that you have to take the time and be guided through in some ways to understand what your own biases are and how biases surface. Checkup's done a really nice job of rolling out training. Prior companies that I've been at have done a really nice job of putting that training front and center. If your company doesn't offer it, it's something that you can go seek out. But it is like creating that conscious awareness is really important. And then I would say it is what we talked about here, having that voice and being willing to openly challenge where you see bias come up, and your own bias, like being accountable to when you hold bias. Even things like recency bias, is a really important thing when we talk about performance management and things like that. But I would say not being afraid when you're having those conversations to call out the bias maybe influencing it is the way that we all fight it together. Is putting your voice, and in some cases your story, and maybe the fact that your way of working is going to break the normal, helps people sort of decouple some of the assumptions and baggage that they may be carrying into those conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Celine, so you had a pretty interesting start to your career, which I'm sure most of our viewers are not aware of. You actually served in the French Navy. So I'm sure you probably encountered some degree of gender stereotypes and preconceived notions there. I would love to hear a little bit more about that, and how did you navigate those assumptions? And also, I guess, what advice would you give to women who are working in other typically male-dominated industries?
Yeah, I have lots of stories, that now maybe looking back feel funny. They didn't feel funny at the time, but it started early actually. My math teacher in high school, I wanted to pursue France's most prestigious sort of math and engineering path, and it's a very male-dominated path. And her response to me, it was actually a woman, unfortunately, was, well, if you'll have to study so hard, you won't even have time to wash your hair. To which, I thought, I'm not sure you would have said that to one of my male colleagues. But, these situations for me have always been a motivator in terms of, if people think I can't do it, then I'm going to show them that I can do it. And when I got deployed on an oil tanker, I was the only woman on board, and there were a few of us who were young officers who were learning in order to be navigators. And so when you start, there's always you're doubled up, right, with a more experienced navigator, and then ultimately the captain decides that you're ready to do it on your own. And I was the first one that they allowed to navigate the oil tanker on my own, and of course it was a great achievement. I was very proud, but I think it was all about it. For me, it's always been about grit and hard work, and making sure that if somebody has a bias against me, I'm going to do everything I can to show them that they're wrong. And I'm also very grateful for the people who have supported me and looked beyond it, right? So that captain decided to let me go first and not the men who were on the boat, with me. And there's been times in my career, even at McKinsey, where I remember I was a young partner, and I was working with a more experienced partner, and we were trying to basically sell a very large piece of work to a CEO. We were successful, and when it was time to start the work, the CEO said, "Well, she's not going to do the work. I'm going to get surely somebody else to do the work." And this more experienced partner, who's still a very good friend and mentor of mine, said, "The reason you're getting Celine and she's so young is because she's so good and we promoted her so fast. And so you're very lucky to have her. It's her or it's no study." And I'm grateful for those moments, for those people in my life who have done that as well for me. And again, it's about calling out bias when you see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty galling to hear that those stories have happened to you. I mean, unfortunately, equivalent stories happen every day still. So I think it goes back to the main point about it's just important to kind of share those experiences and do what we can to mitigate them. Speaking of which, obviously, fostering allyship is hugely important when it comes to this cause. And it shouldn't just fall to the women to do all the work. It's about how do we turn everyone around us into an ally, into understanding what equality is and what equity is, and how we get there. So Laura, a question for you on that. I know we talked about this briefly earlier, but can you talk a little bit more about the role that leaders play in fostering allyship and how we can all kind of work together to create a more supportive and inclusive workplace?
Sure. Didn't that story that Celine just told fire something up in you to have an ally like that? I mean, I was like, yes, I'd call on leaders everywhere. Isn't that the leader you want to be? Isn't that what you want to mean in somebody's story, that they then talk about you like that? Because while we're taking the courage to show up and be present and do our thing, it takes somebody else on the opposite side to open the door. And I think that's where allies come in. They need to be opening that door. I think it begins with hiring, to be honest. I think in creating a supportive and inclusive culture, you can talk about doing it, but you won't do it unless there are people there that look like me, look like you, reflect our customers. So I think it begins at hiring. That I know Checkout has a commitment to this, but every organization should not only have a commitment to it, but have a path that demonstrates how you're going to get there. It's very important. And then calling on leaders as to what kind of leader do you want to be? Who are you as a leader if you are not bringing out the best of the people that are in your team? And you won't bring the best out of the people in your team if it is not inclusive, and if you are not supportive, and if you are not meeting them where they are at and in what they need. How different would that story be if Celine said, and he conceded to that CEO and said, okay, you can now have our white male older executive to run this for you because you've asked for it? How different would that story land? So I think it's a challenge to every leader that is listening to this right now. If you are not that leader today, if you are not being that ally today, this is the goal. This is the bar that needs to be hit, and be somebody in somebody's story. We talk a lot about kids in sport. All they need is one coach that believes in them, and you see them grow an inch. It's the same thing. We are all grown-up toddlers, just moving in different circles as we get older. It doesn't change. It doesn't change whether it's on a sporting field, whether it's in your workplace. And I just think there's such an opportunity for leaders to be real leaders.
you said be somebody in somebody's story, and I just loved that. I think you can be a bad somebody in somebody's story, or you can be a good somebody in somebody's story, right? And that is the choice and challenge for every leader, regardless of gender or experience. And just to double down on that, we got a comment on LinkedIn that says Celine's story is so relevant, celebrating when we have allies and advocates and experiences like that in our career. So, I mean, I think that just speaks to the point of course, we need to share our experiences and, the negative ones, but it's equally important to hold up what great allyship looks like. So Jenny, a question for you. As a female leader, what advice do you have for male allies who want to be more effective in supporting women's advancement and creating a more inclusive workplace? And I think that ties in pretty well to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, this is something that I hold near and dear to my heart in terms of the concept of male advocates for this, in part because all of my managers and all of my leaders' managers have always been men. And for the vast majority of women, that is the case. The numbers are going to dictate that is the case. And I've been really fortunate in having some really strong mentors early in my career, and they were all also men, but they were amazing advocates for me. And I think that, like Celine, and like so many other women, because women are such high achievers, it is a convergence of bias on both gender and age that often surfaces. And so I would say for male leaders out there, you're already in this position, to Laura's point. It's just a question of what do you do with it. You're already managing high potential women. You are already in this position to create those outcomes. And so I would say it is a mindset shift in part, which is that you're in the game. It's what you make of it here. And I also think a big part of it, and a big part, if I'm honest, when I think about equity, is about being dynamic to that as well. For so many women, particularly if you choose to be a mother, what you need changes a lot on that journey, because what is happening at home changes very quickly as well. And so it also encourage, for male advocates to always challenge the question of like, what do the folks that work for me or work around me need now, this year, this month, this quarter? Because it could be very different from what it was last year or what it will be next year. And I think that for women, but for all parents, that's like a natural journey. But I think that women more than any end up impacted by that ebb and flow that actually changes what they need from the work world. So my advice to men is there's no playbook here, and actually it's going to change all the time. And so constantly check back and revisit on what creates that equitable outcome for the women on your team.
Yeah. It's not a checkbox exercise, right? Like it's not like a one and done or a one size fits all model. It's really about like empathy over time and kind of checking in and being consistent in that sense. So we have another question from the group, and by the way, I'll continue to take questions for the remaining time that we have. So please, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and I will be on high alert. This question is about using data to help us drive equity. I'll read the question exactly as it is, and then I would like to add my own sort of question for the group. So the question is, how can we use and potentially publish data that helps us drive equity? And my sort of additional question to that is, what are the benefits and pitfalls, do you think, of using data and statistics in this endeavor? And Celine, why don't we start with you if you have thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think data is very important. I don't think it's the only thing, that you want to use, but I think it's very important. So for instance, I think especially, in a team of 10, data is harder, but in a large scaled organization, if you look at promotions, for instance, are you seeing the same rate of promotion in women that you see in men at the same levels, right? In similar roles and in similar circumstances, because of course you have to sort of, control for that. But I think it's very important to look at that. And Of course, there's also pay equity, which is something that you can look at. Again, for similar roles, similarly situated, is the data showing you that that you have no bias? There's other maybe things that I've seen in the past, which is maybe a little less data driven, but even like observing, experts observing language in reviews to see if there's any bias in the language that's being used by certain leaders. So I think tools like that can certainly be quite helpful. You asked Camilla about pitfall. I would say the pitfall of data can be perhaps if you're working with a really small team or a small data set, of course, that can be skewed. But again, if you're looking at the scale of an organization, I think the data can be quite helpful.
Agreed. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I think an important piece of this is I think there's some areas around data that are so critical to be fully transparent about. And I know Checkout's, done a good job of, where like for hiring trends for our women in certain levels of the company, we're putting that data front and center in front of leaders all the time. And that is and in front of the company, is really important. I think there are also some data like, and Celine mentioned it around the gender pay gap. There's some things like compensation that are just so sensitive in topics, and you don't want to use data in a sense that, particularly if your data set is not big enough, that ends up creating negative outcomes as well. So I would say that it's something that I know a lot of companies are getting so much pressure to be fully transparent on every level. And I think that it's really important that the right people are always looking at the data. I do think when your data sets are small, to Celine's point, that you need to make sure that they're positive and actionable outcomes from it, as compared to it being sharing data for the sake of data that also can sometimes create negative outcomes. And so for folks at smaller companies, that could be one of the reasons why certain data points aren't shared super freely.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And I think I'm no mathematician, unlike Celine, but I think we know that there's confounding factors. And I think it's such an important and sensitive issue that we have to be pay attention to the details in the data rather than making sweeping statements and just looking for a headline, that sort of thing. That's something I always think about when I see data on this respect. And we've covered a lot of the different confounding factors, I think, as part of this conversation. So we just have a couple minutes to go. So I am going to ask you some quick fire questions, if that is okay. So the first question is, who was or is your role model and why? I'm going to come to you first, Laura, but if you want to pass it to someone else while you think, that's fine.
No, you're fine. My role models, I've had a few, as Jenny alluded to earlier. As you go through different stages of your career, you have different needs, and therefore you look to different people for answers. None of mine are famous. All of mine are the everyday men and women who held me together as I have carved a path on this journey. Many and all actually I would be thankful to call very good friends now. Whether it was a friend of mine who was one baby ahead of me as I was having mine, and I would appear back to work, and all you need is the head tilt to go, "You all right? Need a cup of tea?" And that's what was needed, and you would go and they would support you in that. Or, two of my brothers are excellent at, would you be saying that if you were a man? Would you? Would you have that response if that was the case? So my role models are very much people who shore up the vulnerabilities that I have had in the moments that I've been going through my career. Yeah, that's who I would look up to.
I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to reemphasize what Laura said, in that for me, it's also those closest to me. I have two older sisters who are high achievers. I once joked with Celine that I was the black sheep of my family, and she was like, "Who else is in your family?" And so that says something. And they're both mothers, and they're both just have done an outstanding job developing their careers, and a mother who did the same, who was a political journalist at Time Magazine in the early 70s. And like, man, what a life that must have been. And I'm so lucky to have those sort of women in my family and so close to me and so accessible and know so much about me that they've really, they're the people I look up to most, and also they're the people that have been most helpful to me.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, very much the same. To me, it's been the people who have given me confidence when I was lacking it. There's been, some people like that early in my career when I was at McKinsey who really gave me a lot of confidence. When I had a lot of doubts and imposter syndrome, it's my husband who also, like Laura's brother, is very good at telling me, are you thinking like a woman right now? And encouraging me to take risk when I'm not as confident about taking them. So those are my heroes.
But also Beyonce. Beyonce is also great.
You've been a referral friend, Camilla. I think we would be very good friends. Michelle Obama as well, if anyone would like to refer her, I think we would get on.
I've been writing her for years and I've yet to receive a response, but we're on the same page. Would love to be best friends with either of those two. Amazing. Okay, if you could give one piece of advice to the next generation of female leaders, what would it be? It's a big question, but let me know what you've got.
Be more confident, take more risks.
Such a good one.
Compete.
Yeah, compete. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say now is your time. Compete.
And also that you're capable of so much more than you think you are. Like when I look at, this is such a funny thing to say, but when I look at how I spent my time when I was younger, like it's not to say that every time needs to be optimized, but it is to say that like you can be so much more efficient than you realize. And I think that if you start to look at it that way, it really helps you when you think about balance too, when things get out of balance, which I think is something that happens for a lot of women. But is to be like, time is your greatest gift for everyone. But I also think for women, it's something you have to be like super thoughtful about where and how you're investing your time. And so I'd say the earlier you can start thinking about it that way, the better your outcomes will be.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And it makes me think of the fact that when looking at a job description, women will only apply if they feel they meet a minimum of like 80% or 90% of the required qualifications. Men will find one thing in that lineup, like literally 10% of the job spec, and be like, yep, I can do that, and wing in an application. And, we just, to your point, Celine, be confident. To your point, Laura, compete. And I think those things remain super true. And we have a comment from a LinkedIn user who says, maybe a cliche, but have no boundaries. And I think that's a worthwhile comment too, right? Which is just like, don't put boundaries on yourself. Don't limit yourself in terms of what you think you can achieve. So I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for being my panel. It's been really great to get all of your thoughts on such an important topic. And I look forward to continuing the conversation within Checkout with all of you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, guys.